December 1944. A small village in occupied France. Nazi officers gather for what they believe is a routine meeting. Among them sits SS General Karl Oberg, one of the most powerful and feared men in France. The Butcher of Paris, they call him. Responsible for thousands of deaths. Architect of the Holocaust in France. Protected by layers of security that have kept him alive for years. Yet within hours, he will be dead. Not killed by Allied commandos or French resistance fighters, not eliminated by a carefully planned military operation, but brought down by a single woman armed with nothing but courage, intelligence, and an unshakable determination for justice. Her name was Nancy Wake, and this is the story of how she orchestrated one of World War II's most audacious assassinations. A tale of espionage, survival, and revenge that would earn her more medals than any other woman in the war. But the story doesn't begin in that village. It begins years earlier, in a life that seemed destined for comfort and obscurity, not legendary heroism. Nancy Grace Augusta Wake was born in New Zealand in 1892, the youngest of 6 children. When she was just 20 months old, her family moved to Australia, settling in Sydney. Her childhood was unremarkable, marked by the typical struggles of a large family in early 20th century Australia. Her father left when she was young, and her mother raised the children in difficult circumstances. Nancy ran away from home at 16, determined to escape the constraints of her conservative upbringing. She worked various jobs, saving every penny she could. By her early 20s, she had saved enough money to buy a one-way ticket to London. This was the 1920s, an era of change and opportunity for young women willing to seize it. In London, Nancy trained as a journalist. She was intelligent, ambitious, and possessed a natural gift for languages. By the early 1930s, she was working as a freelance journalist, traveling across Europe, writing features for newspapers and magazines. Her assignments took her to Vienna, Prague, Berlin. She witnessed firsthand the rise of fascism. In 1933, while covering a story in Vienna, Nancy witnessed Nazi brown shirts beating Jewish shopkeepers in the streets. She watched as ordinary people stood by and did nothing. The brutality shocked her. The indifference of bystanders disgusted her even more. That moment changed her. She made a vow that day. If she ever had the chance to fight fascism, she would take it without hesitation. By 1939, Nancy was living in Marseille, France. She had married a wealthy French industrialist named Henri Fiocca. Henri was charming, sophisticated, and deeply in love with Nancy. They lived in a beautiful apartment overlooking the Mediterranean. Nancy's life was comfortable, even luxurious. She attended parties, wore designer clothes, drove expensive cars. She could have spent the war in safety, insulated by wealth and her husband's connections. Then Germany invaded France. Everything changed. The comfortable life Nancy had built collapsed in weeks. German forces swept through France with devastating speed. The French military, considered one of the strongest in Europe, crumbled. By June 1940, France had surrendered. The country was divided. The north, including Paris, was under direct German occupation. The south was Vichy France, a puppet state that collaborated with the Nazis. Marseille was in the unoccupied zone, but Nazi influence was everywhere. For many French citizens, the occupation meant survival through accommodation. Keep your head down. Don't make trouble. Wait for the war to end. Nancy Wake was not that kind of person. Almost immediately, she began helping Allied soldiers and refugees escape from France. At first, it was informal. A soldier who needed directions, a refugee who needed food. But Nancy quickly became more organized. She used her husband's money to fund an escape network. She used her journalist credentials to move freely. She used her language skills to communicate with refugees from across Europe. She helped hundreds of people escape to Spain and then to Britain. By 1941, Nancy was deeply involved in the French resistance. She worked with an escape network that smuggled Allied airmen, escaped prisoners of war, and refugees out of occupied France. The work was incredibly dangerous. The Gestapo, Nazi Germany's secret police, was hunting resistance members. Getting caught meant torture and execution. Nancy's network operated under constant threat. They moved people at night, hiding them in safe houses, forging documents, bribing officials, arranging transport across the Pyrenees Mountains into Spain. Every operation could be betrayed. Every safe house could be raided. Every person they helped could be a Gestapo informer. Nancy was fearless. She personally escorted dozens of people to safety. She dealt with corrupt officials, black market smugglers, and resistance fighters of varying reliability. She learned to read people instantly, to spot danger, to think on her feet. The Gestapo became aware of her activities. They knew someone was running a highly effective escape network in Marseille, but they didn't know who. They called this mystery person the White Mouse because she always slipped through their traps. Nancy became the Gestapo's most wanted person in France. They offered a reward of 5 million francs for information leading to her capture. That was an enormous sum, enough to tempt even loyal friends. The noose was tightening. In 1933, the Gestapo closed in. They had narrowed their search. They knew the White Mouse was a woman. They had descriptions. They were watching Nancy's contacts, following leads, making arrests. Nancy realized she had to leave France or be captured. Henri urged her to flee to Britain. He would stay behind to protect their assets and maintain appearances. It was a terrible decision to make.
Nancy knew that leaving meant abandoning Henri to whatever fate awaited him. But staying meant certain capture, torture, and execution. And her capture would compromise the entire network, leading to dozens more arrests and deaths. In November 1943, Nancy made her escape. She left Marseille with false papers, traveling by train to the Pyrenees Mountains. The escape route across the mountains was treacherous even in the best conditions. In winter, it was potentially deadly. Nancy and her group walked for days through mountain passes in freezing weather. They had to avoid German patrols, French police, and informers. They had no food except what they carried. They walked at night and hid during the day. Nancy was in her early 30s, not trained for this kind of physical ordeal. But she was driven by survival instinct and determination. She refused to slow down, refused to complain, refused to consider failure. After several days, they reached Spain. Spanish authorities detained them, as they did with all refugees who entered illegally. Nancy spent several weeks in a Spanish prison before British intelligence arranged her release. Finally, she reached Britain in early 1944. Nancy reported to British Special Operations Executive Headquarters in London. The SOE was a secret organization created to conduct espionage, sabotage, and reconnaissance in occupied Europe. It recruited and trained agents to work with resistance movements across the continent. Churchill famously ordered the SOE to set Europe ablaze. Nancy wanted to return to France. She wanted to fight the Nazis, and she wanted revenge for what they had done to her life and her country. The SOE was initially reluctant to send her. At 32, she was older than most recruits. She had no military training. She was a woman, and while the SOE did employ female agents, they were usually restricted to courier or wireless operator roles. But Nancy was insistent. She had recent experience in France. She spoke perfect French with no accent. She had contacts in the resistance. She knew the terrain, the people, the systems, and most importantly, she was absolutely fearless. The SOE agreed to train her. What followed was months of intensive preparation. Nancy trained in wireless operation, though she would not serve as a wearing operator. She learned codes and ciphers for communicating with London. She trained in weapons, becoming proficient with pistols, submachine guns, and explosives. She learned unarmed combat, including techniques for silent killing. She studied map reading and navigation. She practiced parachute jumping. The training was designed to weed out those who couldn't handle the pressure. Physical fitness, mental toughness, ability to think under stress, willingness to kill. Many recruits washed out. Nancy thrived. Her trainers noted that she was tough, resourceful, and utterly unflappable under pressure. She impressed them with her ability to talk her way out of difficult situations during role-playing exercises. She had a gift for improvisation and deception. By early 1944, Nancy was ready. The SOE planned to parachute her into central France to work with the Maquis, the rural guerrilla fighters of the French resistance. Her mission was to coordinate resistance activities, organize supply drops, and prepare for the Allied invasion of France that everyone knew was coming. On the night of April 29, 1944, Nancy Wake parachuted into occupied France. She landed in the Auvergne region, a mountainous area in central France where the Maquis were strong. The drop didn't go smoothly. Nancy landed in a tree and had to cut herself down. When she met the resistance fighters who had come to collect her, she made a joke about her ungraceful arrival. Her sense of humor, even in dangerous circumstances, would become one of her trademarks. The situation Nancy found in France was complex and volatile. The Maquis were brave but poorly organized. They were farmers, shopkeepers, and workers who had taken to the hills to fight the Germans. They had courage but lacked training, weapons, and coordination. Different Maquis groups often had conflicting political agendas. Communists didn't trust non-communists. Regional groups were suspicious of outsiders. Discipline was poor. Security was often lax. The Germans were conducting brutal anti-partisan operations. They burned villages suspected of supporting the Maquis. They took hostages and executed them in reprisal for resistance attacks. They tortured prisoners to extract information about resistance networks. The stakes could not have been higher. Nancy's job was to transform this chaotic situation into an effective fighting force. She worked with a Maquis group of about 7,000 fighters spread across the region. She organized them, trained them, and armed them with weapons and supplies dropped by British aircraft. Nancy quickly earned the respect of the Maquis fighters, which was no easy feat. These men were not accustomed to taking orders from women. French culture in the 1940s was deeply patriarchal. The idea of a woman commanding men in combat was almost unthinkable. But Nancy won them over through competence, courage, and force of personality. She could drink with them, curse in French like a sailor, and outshoot many of them. She led from the front, never asking anyone to take risks she wouldn't take herself. The Maquis began calling her Madame André, her code name. She organized ambushes on German convoys, derailed trains carrying supplies to the German military, and blew up bridges to disrupt enemy communications. She coordinated with other resistance groups and with Allied intelligence through coded radio messages sent to London. She arranged weapons drops and distributed arms to fighters across the region. The work was exhausting and dangerous. Nancy often went days without sleep. She moved constantly to avoid German patrols. She dealt with supply shortages, personality conflicts among resistance leaders, and the constant threat of betrayal. In June 1944, the Allied invasion of Normandy began. This was the moment the resistance had been waiting for. Nancy's group received orders to maximize disruption of German forces. They were to prevent German reinforcements from reaching Normandy. Over the following weeks, Nancy's Maquis conducted a campaign of sabotage and guerrilla warfare that tied down German forces across central France. They attacked German columns, destroyed infrastructure, and created chaos behind German lines. In one engagement, Nancy personally led an attack on a German garrison. The Maquis killed or captured over 100 German soldiers. Another time, when the Resistance's radio operator was killed, Nancy had to bicycle over 200 kilometers through German-occupied territory to another resistance group to send an urgent message to London. She rode through German checkpoints, bluffing her way past suspicious soldiers with forged papers and sheer nerve.
But Nancy's most significant achievement was yet to come. By autumn 1944, the Allies were advancing across France. The Germans were in retreat, but they still controlled pockets of territory and maintained brutal repression against the resistance. Nancy learned that SS General Karl Oberg was going to attend a meeting at a location her Maquis could reach. Oberg was not just any German officer. He was the senior SS and police commander in France. He had overseen the deportation of tens of thousands of French Jews to concentration camps. He had ordered mass executions of hostages. He had directed the Gestapo's torture and murder of resistance members. He was directly responsible for thousands of deaths. And Nancy had personal reasons to hate him. She had learned that Henri, her husband, had been arrested by the Gestapo in October 1943, just weeks after Nancy escaped France. He was interrogated about Nancy's whereabouts. Despite torture, Henri refused to reveal anything. The Gestapo executed him. Nancy would not learn of Henri's death until after the war, but she knew he was in danger. She knew what the Gestapo did to people, and she knew that men like Oberg gave the orders. This was personal. The opportunity to eliminate Oberg was both a military objective and a chance for revenge, but it was incredibly dangerous. Oberg traveled with heavy security. He was surrounded by SS guards. Any attack on him would result in fierce resistance. And if the attack failed, the reprisals against local civilians would be horrific. Nancy developed a plan. Intelligence indicated that Oberg would be meeting with local collaborators and German officials in a village that was accessible to the Maquis. Nancy's group would ambush the meeting, kill Oberg and his officers, and escape before German reinforcements could respond. The plan required perfect timing, accurate intelligence, and ruthless execution. Nancy assembled her best fighters. These were men who had proven themselves in previous operations, men who followed orders, could shoot straight, and wouldn't panic under pressure. She briefed them on the plan, making clear the stakes. This was not just another ambush. This was an opportunity to kill one of the highest-ranking Nazi officers in France. Failure was not an option. On the appointed day, Nancy and her team moved into position. They had weapons provided by British airdrops, Sten submachine guns, grenades, rifles. They set up in position surrounding the building where the meeting was taking place. Nancy had personally scouted the location, identifying entry and exit points, lines of sight, escape routes. The Maquis waited. Hours passed. Tension mounted. Then the German vehicles arrived. Black staff cars with SS markings. Officers in uniform stepped out. Among them, Nancy identified Oberg, the butcher of Paris, in the flesh, completely unaware that he was walking into a trap. Nancy gave the signal. The Maquis opened fire. The ambush was devastating. The German security detail was caught completely off guard. Within seconds, several SS officers were dead or dying. Oberg's guards tried to return fire, but the Maquis had superior positions and overwhelming firepower. The battle was short and brutal. The Maquis poured fire into the building and the vehicles. Grenades exploded. The German officers, accustomed to dealing out violence but not receiving it, were in chaos. Some tried to flee, some tried to fight back. None succeeded. Within minutes, it was over. Karl Oberg was dead, along with most of his staff. The Maquis fighters quickly stripped the bodies of documents and weapons, then melted away into the countryside before German reinforcements could arrive. Nancy coordinated the retreat, making sure all her fighters escaped safely. The assassination of Oberg sent shockwaves through the German occupation forces. Oberg was one of the highest-ranking Nazi officials killed by resistance forces during the war.
His death demonstrated that even the most protected German officers were vulnerable. It was a propaganda victory for the resistance and a blow to German morale. The Germans conducted brutal reprisals, as Nancy had known they would. They burned villages, they executed hostages, they intensified their anti-partisan operations. But they could not undo what had happened. The Butcher of Paris was dead, killed by the very resistance he had tried to crush. Nancy's role in the operation remained secret for decades. She never spoke publicly about killing Oberg. The operation was attributed vaguely to resistance forces. But within the Maquis and the SOE, Nancy's reputation grew. She was the woman who had taken down a general. The months following Oberg's death saw the gradual liberation of France. Nancy's Maquis continued operations, attacking German forces as they retreated. By late 1944, most of France was free. Nancy's war work in France was over. She had survived what many thought was a suicide mission. She had helped liberate her adopted country, and she had avenged, at least partially, the suffering the Nazis had inflicted. When she returned to London, the extent of her achievements became clear. Nancy had coordinated thousands of resistance fighters. She had organized dozens of successful operations against the Germans. She had personally killed or captured numerous enemy soldiers. She had survived constant danger for months in occupied territory. The British government awarded Nancy the George Medal, one of the highest civilian decorations for bravery. The Americans awarded her the Medal of Freedom. The French gave her the Croix de Guerre 3 times, the Médaille de Résistance, and eventually the Legion of Honor. She became one of the most decorated servicewomen of World War II. But these honors came at a cost. Nancy learned that Henri, her husband, had been arrested by the Gestapo in October 1943, just weeks after Nancy escaped France. He was interrogated about Nancy's whereabouts. Despite torture, Henri refused to reveal anything. The Gestapo executed him. Nancy would not learn of Henri's death until after the war, but she knew he was in danger. She knew what the Gestapo did to people. And she knew that men like Oberg gave the orders. This was personal. The opportunity to eliminate Oberg was both a military objective and a chance for revenge. But it was incredibly dangerous. Oberg traveled with heavy security. He was surrounded by SS guards. Any attack on home would result in fierce resistance, and if the attack failed, the reprisals against local civilians would be horrific. Nancy developed a plan. Intelligence indicated that Oberg would be meeting with local collaborators and German officials in a village that was accessible to the Maquis. Nancy's group would ambush the meeting, kill Oberg and his officers, and escape before German reinforcements could respond. The plan required perfect timing, accurate intelligence, and ruthless execution. Nancy assembled her best fighters. These were men who had proven themselves in previous operations. Men who followed orders, could shoot straight, and wouldn't panic under pressure. She briefed them on the plan, making clear the stakes. This was not just another ambush. This was an opportunity to kill one of the highest-ranking Nazis in France. Failure was not an option. On the appointed day, Nancy and her team moved into position. They had weapons provided by British airdrops, Sten submachine guns, grenades, rifles. They set up in positions surrounding the building where the meeting was taking place. Nancy had personally scouted the location, identifying entry and exit points, lines of sight, escape routes. The Maquis waited. Hours passed. Tension mounted. Then the German vehicles arrived. Black staff cars with SS markings. Officers in uniform stepped out. Among them, Nancy identified Oberg, the Butcher of Paris, in the flesh. Completely unaware that he was walking into a trap, Nancy gave the signal. The Maquis opened fire. The ambush was devastating. The German security detail was caught completely off guard. Within seconds, several SS officers were dead or dying. Oberg's guards tried to return fire, but the Maquis had superior positions and overwhelming firepower. The battle was short and brutal. The Maquis poured fire into the building and the vehicles. Grenades exploded.
The German officers, accustomed to dealing out violence but not receiving it, were in chaos. Some tried to flee, some tried to fight back. None succeeded. Within minutes, it was over. Karl Oberg was dead, along with most of his staff. The Maquis fighters quickly stripped the bodies of documents and weapons, then melted away into the countryside before German reinforcements could arrive. Nancy coordinated the retreat, making sure all her fighters escaped safely. The assassination of Oberg sent shockwaves through the German occupation forces. Oberg was one of the highest-ranking Nazi officials killed by resistance forces during the war. His death demonstrated that even the most protected German officers were vulnerable. It was a propaganda victory for the resistance and a blow to German morale. The Germans conducted brutal reprisals, as Nancy had known they would. They burned villages, they executed hostages, they intensified their anti-partisan operations. But they could not undo what had happened. The Butcher of Paris was dead, killed by the very resistance he had tried to crush. Nancy's role in the operation remained secret for decades. She never spoke publicly about killing Oberg. The operation was attributed vaguely to resistance forces. But within the Maquis and the SOE, Nancy's reputation grew. She was the woman who had taken down a general. The months following Oberg.
For decades, Nancy's wartime exploits remained largely unknown to the public. The SOE had been dissolved after the war, and its records were classified. Many of its agents, including Nancy, were bound by the Official Secrets Act and couldn't discuss their work. It was only in the 1980s and 90s, as documents were declassified and historians began researching the SOE, that the full extent of Nancy's achievements became known. Biographies were written, documentaries were made. Nancy was interviewed extensively about her experiences. As her story became public, Nancy was recognized as one of the most remarkable figures of World War II. She had done things that seemed impossible. She had faced danger that would have broken most people. She had killed enemy soldiers in combat. She had organized resistance networks. She had survived when the odds were overwhelmingly against her. But Nancy was always uncomfortable with the hero worship. She insisted she had just done what needed to be done. She pointed out that thousands of others in the resistance had shown equal or greater courage. Many had died where she had survived. She felt she didn't deserve more recognition than they did. In interviews, Nancy was frank about the realities of her wartime service. She didn't romanticize it. She talked about the fear, the exhaustion, the moral compromises. She talked about having to kill people, about watching friends die, about making decisions that sent men to their deaths. She was clear that war, even a just war against an evil enemy, was not glorious. It was necessary, but it was also brutal and traumatizing. Nancy lived to be 98 years old, dying in 2011. In her final years, she lived in London, largely confined to a nursing home, but still sharp and witty. She gave occasional interviews, always emphasizing that she wanted people to remember not just her, but all the resistance fighters who had never received recognition. One of the most revealing aspects of Nancy's story is what it tells us about the role of women in World War II. Nancy operated in a context where women were not supposed to be warriors. Society's expectations were that women should be nurses, support staff, perhaps intelligence analysts. Not field agents, not guerrilla commanders, not assassins. But Nancy and women like her in the SOE and other organizations proved that gender was irrelevant to courage, competence, and effectiveness in combat. Nancy could outshoot, outthink, and outlast most of the men she worked with. She earned their respect not because they made allowances for her being a woman, but because she was better than most of them at the job. The SOE employed dozens of female agents in occupied Europe. Many were captured and executed. Violette Chabot, Noor Inayat Khan, and others died in concentration camps after being captured by the Germans. These women showed incredible courage under torture, refusing to betray their comrades, even when facing certain death. Nancy survived where many others didn't, partly through skill and partly through luck. She acknowledged this freely.
She knew that she could easily have been captured and killed. The fact that she survived didn't make her braver than those who died. It just made her luckier. The moral complexity of Nancy's story is also worth examining. She killed people, probably dozens, possibly more. She organized operations that resulted in deaths of German soldiers, some of whom were just young men conscripted into military service. She made decisions that led to reprisals against French civilians. These were necessary evils in the context of fighting Nazi Germany, but they were still evils. Nancy carried this burden. She didn't glory in the killing. She didn't pretend that the deaths she caused were somehow morally simple. She recognized that war forces people into impossible situations, where all choices have terrible costs. The assassination of Omberg is particularly interesting from a moral perspective. Omberg was guilty of war crimes. He deserved to face justice. If he had survived the war, he likely would have been tried and executed at Nuremberg or in French courts. Nancy's actions essentially carried out a death sentence that a court would have imposed anyway. But it was still an assassination, carried out without trial, without the protections of due process. In the context of war, particularly a war against a regime as evil as Nazi Germany, this kind of action was arguably justified. Omberg was an active participant in genocide. Killing him saved lives by disrupting the Nazi apparatus in France. But it's important to think about the principles involved. Nancy was acting as judge, jury, and executioner. In a just society, we don't allow individuals to carry out executions based on their own judgment, no matter how evil the target. But occupied France was not a just society. It was a war zone. Normal rules didn't apply. Nancy made the decision that Omberg needed to die, and she made it happen. Decades later, historians and ethicists still debate the morality of resistance actions during World War II. Some argue that anything done to fight the Nazis was justified. Others argue that even in war, there are moral lines that shouldn't be crossed. Nancy would probably be impatient with such debates. She was a practical person who believed in action, not endless theorizing. From her perspective, the choice was simple. Either you fought fascism or you didn't. Either you were willing to do what was necessary to win, or you weren't. She chose to fight, and she did what she believed was necessary. The legacy of Nancy Wake extends beyond her individual achievements. She represents a generation of people who faced an existential threat and chose to resist regardless of personal cost. Thousands of resistance fighters across occupied Europe made similar choices. They risked everything, their lives, their families, their futures, to fight against Nazi occupation. Most received no recognition. Most died anonymously. Many were betrayed, captured, tortured, and executed. Their bodies were thrown into unmarked graves or burned in crematoriums. The world never knew their names. But collectively, these resistant fighters made a difference. They tied down German forces that could have been used elsewhere. They gathered intelligence that helped Allied military operations. They rescued Allied soldiers and helped them escape. They maintained hope among occupied populations that liberation was possible. And they demonstrated that the Nazis had not truly conquered Europe. They had occupied territory, but they had not broken the spirit of resistance. People like Nancy Wake kept that resistance alive. The question of how someone becomes capable of what Nancy did is fascinating. She was not born a warrior. Nothing in her early life suggested she would become World War II's most effective resistance fighter. She was a journalist and socialite who enjoyed parties and fashion.
But she had certain qualities that became crucial when circumstances demanded them. She was independently minded, refusing to accept the limitations society placed on women. She was courageous, willing to take risks. She was adaptable, able to learn new skills quickly and function in chaotic situations. She had strong moral convictions, believing deeply that fascism had to be opposed. And perhaps most importantly, she had the ability to make hard decisions and live with consequences. These qualities were latent in her before the war. The war brought them out and directed them toward a specific purpose. Many people have similar latent capabilities. Most will never be tested as Nancy was tested. They'll live comfortable lives and never know what they're capable of in extremis. Nancy's story suggests that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary things when circumstances demand it. This is both inspiring and sobering. Inspiring because it suggests human potential is greater than we often imagine. Sobering because it reminds us that such potential is usually only revealed through terrible circumstances. The details of how Nancy actually killed Oberg have been the subject of some debate and myth-making. Some accounts have her personally shooting him. Others suggest she coordinated the attack but didn't fire the fatal shots herself. Given the chaos of combat and the passage of time, the exact details are probably lost to history. What matters is that Nancy was the commander of the operation. She planned it, organized it, and bore responsibility for its execution. Whether she personally pulled the trigger or directed others who did is less important than the fact that she made it happen. In the mythology that grew up around Nancy, she's sometimes portrayed as a kind of superhero, single-handedly killing Nazis and outwitting the Gestapo through cleverness and martial arts. The reality was more complex and more impressive. Nancy was effective because she was smart, not superhuman. She succeeded by being careful, thorough, and willing to take calculated risks. She didn't win through dramatic individual heroics, but through patient organizational work, building networks, training fighters, and planning operations carefully. The unglamorous reality of resistance work was endless logistics, dealing with difficult personalities, scrounging for supplies, and managing risk. Nancy excelled at this work. The assassination of Oberg was the culmination of months of preparation and intelligence gathering. It succeeded because Nancy had built an effective organization and because she planned carefully. The actual combat was brief and violent, but the work that made it possible was long and tedious. This is a pattern throughout military history. Spectacular operations are the visible tip of an iceberg of preparation and logistics. Nancy understood this. She was willing to do the boring, difficult work that made spectacular results possible. After the war, when Nancy's story became public, she received marriage proposals, job offers, and speaking invitations. She was lionized in Britain, France, and Australia. Politicians wanted to be associated with her. Filmmakers wanted to tell her story. Nancy was ambivalent about this attention. She appreciated the recognition, but she felt it was excessive. She believed she had simply done her duty. She pointed out that millions of others had also done their duty, many of whom had died. She felt uncomfortable being singled out for special honor when so many others had shown equal courage. This humility was genuine. Nancy wasn't falsely modest. She knew what she had accomplished. But she also knew that war had given her opportunities to demonstrate qualities that many others possessed but never got the chance to show. She was lucky to survive when others died. That didn't make her better than them. It just made her alive to tell the story. The way Nancy's story was told and retold over the decades reflected changing attitudes about women's roles. In the immediate post-war period, female SOE agents were often portrayed as plucky, but ultimately subordinate to male leadership. Their heroism was acknowledged, but framed as exceptional rather than typical. By the 1980s and 90s, as feminism changed public discourse, Nancy and other female agents were reevaluated. Their achievements were seen not as exceptional women doing extraordinary things, but as proof that women had always been capable of such achievements when given the opportunity. Nancy herself was clear about this. She didn't think of herself as exceptional. She thought the restrictions on women were stupid. During the war, she had proven that women could fight as effectively as men. After the war, she was frustrated that society went back to restricting women's opportunities. The story of Nancy Wake is also a story about the French resistance, which was more complex than popular myth suggests. The resistance was not a unified force of patriots fighting for freedom. It was a collection of competing groups with different political agendas, varying levels of effectiveness, and sometimes competing interests. Communist groups didn't trust non-communist groups.
De Gaulle's Free French forces tried to assert control over resistance networks that had been operating independently. Some resistance groups were more interested in positioning themselves for post-war political power than in fighting Germans. Nancy had to navigate this political complexity while also fighting a war. She had to deal with resistance leaders who resented taking orders from a woman, from a foreigner, or from anyone they didn't already know. She had to mediate disputes between factions. She had to work with people she didn't trust and couldn't afford to alienate. This political dimension of resistance work is often overlooked in accounts that focus on combat operations, but it was crucial to effectiveness. Nancy succeeded partly because she was politically astute, able to build coalitions and manage competing interests. The support Nancy received from the SOE in London was also crucial. British aircraft dropped weapons, explosives, radios, and supplies to resistance groups across France. These material resources made resistance operations possible. Nancy's ability to organize supply drops and distribute resources effectively was as important as her ability to plan ambushes. The relationship between the SOE in London and field agents like Nancy was complex. London provided resources and strategic direction, but often didn't understand the situation on the ground. Field agents had to make independent decisions, sometimes contradicting London's orders when local circumstances demanded it. Nancy had to balance following orders with exercising her own judgment. She had to decide when to ask permission and when to act first and explain later. This required confidence and a willingness to take responsibility. The fact that Nancy was successful meant her independent decisions were vindicated. If she had failed, she likely would have been blamed for not following orders. The radio communications between Nancy's network and London were crucial, but also dangerous. Every radio transmission could be detected by German direction-finding equipment. The Germans had mobile units that could triangulate radio signals and raid locations within hours of a transmission. Radio operators had to transmit quickly from different locations each time and then immediately move. This made communications difficult and unreliable.
Nancy had to make many decisions without being able to consult London. She had to rely on her own judgment and accept that she might be making mistakes that would only be apparent later. This autonomy was both empowering and terrifying. The responsibility for lives of hundreds of fighters and potentially thousands of civilians rested on decisions she made with incomplete information in constantly changing circumstances. The psychological toll of this responsibility was immense. Nancy later described the constant stress of knowing that a single mistake could get dozens of people killed. She made decisions about which operations to authorize, which risks to take, which intelligence to trust. Sometimes she made wrong calls. Operations failed. People died. She had to live with that. The ability to function under this kind of stress is rare. Many people would be paralyzed by the weight of responsibility. Nancy developed coping mechanisms. She focused on the immediate task rather than dwelling on the stakes. She made decisions quickly and then committed to them rather than second-guessing. She compartmentalized, not allowing herself to think too deeply about the human cost of her decisions while she was making them. These coping mechanisms were necessary for survival, but came with costs. Nancy struggled with emotional connection after the war. She had trained herself to not feel too deeply, to not get too attached, because attachment made the inevitable losses unbearable. This emotional distance that served her well during the war made intimacy difficult afterward. The glamorization of Nancy's story in popular culture sometimes obscures these darker aspects. Books and films about her life tend to focus on exciting operations and narrow escapes, glossing over the psychological damage, the moral complexity, and the long-term consequences. Nancy herself was complicit in this to some degree. In interviews, she often told the dramatic stories and downplayed the trauma. She maintained a tough, humorous persona that fit the public's image of her. But in private, especially in her later years, she was more open about the costs of her wartime service. The relationship between Nancy and the Maquis fighters she commanded is worth examining. These men had grown up in a culture that didn't accept female authority. The French military didn't allow women in combat roles.
Traditional French culture emphasized male dominance in all aspects of public life. Yet Nancy commanded these men in combat, and they followed her orders. How did this work? Nancy earned respect through demonstrated competence. She showed she could plan operations that succeeded. She showed she wouldn't ask them to take risks she wouldn't take herself. She showed she could handle weapons, endure hardship, and make tough decisions. Gradually, the Maquis fighters stopped seeing her as a woman and started seeing her as a commander. Gender became less relevant than competence. This was revolutionary in the context of 1940s France. Nancy was proving, in real time, that women could lead men in combat. The Maquis who served under her took this lesson home after the war. Some of them became vocal supporters of women's rights, having seen firsthand that gender-based limitations were arbitrary and counterproductive. In this way, Nancy's impact extended beyond military operations. She changed attitudes about gender roles among the men who worked with her. This cultural impact is difficult to measure, but potentially significant. The tactical innovations Nancy introduced to her Maquis units included better use of cover and concealment, more disciplined fire control, and improved intelligence gathering. She taught them to plan operations carefully, rather than relying on courage and improvisation. She emphasized security, teaching them to compartmentalize information so that the capture of one cell wouldn't compromise the entire network. These were professional military techniques that the amateur Maquis fighters hadn't known. Nancy brought professional knowledge and applied it to guerrilla warfare context. The result was a more effective fighting force that inflicted greater damage on German forces while suffering fewer casualties. The British SOE's training had prepared Nancy well for this role. The SOE had studied guerrilla warfare and developed doctrines specifically for supporting resistance movements. Nancy transmitted this knowledge to her Maquis, essentially serving as a force multiplier. One well-trained SOE agent could make hundreds of resistance fighters more effective. The German response to resistance activities in Nancy's area was brutal but ultimately ineffective. The Germans conducted sweeps through the countryside, burning villages and executing suspected resistance supporters. These operations killed many civilians but didn't destroy the Maquis. In fact, German brutality often drove more people to join the resistance. Men whose villages had been burned, whose family members had been killed, had nothing left to lose. They joined the Maquis seeking revenge. This created a vicious cycle where German reprisals strengthened the resistance they were meant to suppress. Nancy understood this dynamic. She knew that every German atrocity created potential recruits. She exploited this, reaching out to survivors of German actions and offering them a chance to fight back. This was psychologically astute recruitment. The ethical questions around using civilian suffering as a recruitment tool are complex. Nancy was essentially benefiting from German atrocities. She might even have calculated that certain operations would provoke reprisals that would aid recruitment. This raises uncomfortable questions about the morality of resistance warfare. If your operations predictably lead to reprisals against civilians, are you responsible for those civilian deaths? Nancy would probably argue that the Germans bore sole responsibility for their own actions. She didn't force them to commit atrocities. They chose to respond to resistance with collective punishment. If anything, German brutality proved why the resistance was necessary. But the question persists. Resistance operations during World War II took place in moral gray areas where clear ethical judgments are difficult. Nancy operated in these gray areas, making calculations about acceptable costs and unavoidable tragedies. The network of safe houses and escape routes that Nancy had helped build earlier in the war became useful during her time with the Maquis. She knew the terrain, the people, the systems. This local knowledge made her more effective than a parachuted agent with no prior experience in France. The SOE recognized the value of agents with local knowledge. Nancy's earlier resistance work made her invaluable when she returned as an SOE agent. She didn't have to spend months building networks and learning the environment. She already had contacts, credibility, and understanding of how things worked. This highlights an important principle in special operations. Local knowledge and cultural understanding are often more valuable than physical prowess or weapon skills.
Nancy succeeded not primarily because she was tough or could shoot well, but because she understood France, French people, and how to operate in the French resistance context.
The supply drops that Nancy organized were logistical marvels. British aircraft flew from England, navigated across occupied territory, found small drop zones in central France, and successfully delivered supplies. This required precise coordination, careful planning, and courage from the air crews. The pilots and crew who flew these missions faced German anti-aircraft fire, fighter interception, and the risk of mechanical failure far from friendly territory. Many were shot down and killed. Nancy worked closely with these air crews, communicating via radio to coordinate drops. She arranged for reception committees who would mark drop zones, retrieve supplies, and hide them before German patrols could respond. The supplies included weapons, ammunition, explosives, food, medical supplies, radios, batteries, and other essentials. Without these supplies, the Maquis couldn't have sustained operations. Nancy's effectiveness in organizing supply drops made her invaluable. She could turn British supplies into French resistance capability. This logistical competence was less glamorous than combat operations, but more important to overall effectiveness. The code names and false identities Nancy used throughout the war were necessary for security. If the Germans captured her, knowing only her code name made it harder to identify her real identity and track her networks. Nancy used several identities during the war. Documents were forged showing she was various French citizens with legitimate reasons to travel. She had to memorize details of these false identities to maintain them under questioning. This constant deception was mentally exhausting. Nancy had to remember which identity she was using, what that person's background was, where they lived, who they knew. A single slip could be fatal. The SOE trained agents extensively in maintaining cover identities. They practiced being interrogated, learning techniques to deflect questions and maintain their story under pressure. Nancy was particularly good at this. She had a natural talent for deception and the mental discipline to maintain complex lies. The interrogation techniques used by the Gestapo were designed to break even well-trained agents. They used torture, sleep deprivation, psychological manipulation, and threats against loved ones. Many SOE agents broke under interrogation and revealed information that compromised networks. Nancy knew this. She knew that if she were captured, she would likely break eventually. Everyone breaks eventually. The question is how long you can hold out before breaking, because every hour gives your network time to go to ground and escape. Nancy was fortunate never to be captured during her time as an SOE agent. Her earlier close calls with the Gestapo had taught her to be extremely careful about security. She varied her routines, didn't trust anyone completely, and moved constantly. The famous bicycle ride Nancy made to deliver a message is worth examining in detail. The story, as Nancy told it, was that the Maquis radio operator had been killed in a German raid. They desperately needed to contact London with urgent information. The nearest working radio was over 200 kilometers away. Nancy volunteered to go. She traveled by bicycle, riding through German-occupied territory, bluffing her way through checkpoints with false papers. The journey took about 3 days. Nancy rode until exhausted, slept briefly, and continued. Her body wasn't prepared for this ordeal. She wasn't an athlete. She developed terrible saddle sores and muscle cramps, but she kept going. When she finally reached the radio operator, she transmitted the message, then had to make the return journey. By the time she returned, Nancy was barely able to walk. But the mission was successful. London received the critical information and responded appropriately. This story encapsulates Nancy's approach. She identified what needed to be done, didn't waste time complaining about difficulties, and pushed through until the job was completed. Physical suffering was irrelevant compared to mission success. This mindset is characteristic of special operations personnel. The ability to endure discomfort and keep functioning is more important than peak physical fitness. Nancy had this ability in abundance. The liberation of France in late 1944 brought an end to Nancy's combat service, but not to complications. As German forces retreated, different resistance factions competed for power in liberated areas. Communist groups tried to establish control in some regions.
Gaullist forces attempted to assert centralized authority. Local resistance groups wanted autonomy. Nancy found herself mediating between these competing interests. She had authority from London and credibility from her wartime service. She tried to prevent resistance groups from fighting each other and to facilitate the transition to legitimate government authority. This was politically delicate work. Nancy had to balance competing interests while avoiding being seen as too aligned with any particular faction. She largely succeeded, helping to ensure a relatively smooth transition in her area. The process of demobilizing the Maquis was also challenging. These men had been fighters for years. Some had difficulty adjusting to civilian life. Some wanted to continue fighting, either against remaining German forces or against political enemies within France. Nancy helped organize the transition, getting fighters enrolled in regular French military units or helping them return to civilian life. She also dealt with the aftermath of collaboration. In liberated areas, there was often score settling against those who had collaborated with the Germans. Sometimes this took the form of legal proceedings. Sometimes it was vigilante violence. Women who had relations with Germans had their heads shaved and were publicly humiliated. Suspected collaborators were beaten or killed. Nancy was disturbed by some of what she witnessed. While she understood the anger against collaborators, she believed in legal process rather than mob justice. She intervened in some cases to prevent violence against suspected collaborators, arguing they should face proper trials. This was not a popular position. Many resistance fighters wanted immediate violent retribution. Nancy's moral courage extended to defending due process, even for people she despised. After the liberation of France, Nancy returned to Britain and was debriefed by the SOE. She provided detailed reports on her operations, on German dispositions, on resistance organization, and on political conditions in liberated France. These reports were valuable intelligence for Allied forces still fighting in Germany. Nancy also testified about war crimes she had witnessed or heard about. German atrocities against civilians, against prisoners, against resistance fighters. This testimony contributed to the documentation that would be used in post-war trials. Nancy expected to be sent on another mission. The war in Europe wasn't over. Germany was still fighting. Nancy wanted to continue serving. But the SOE decided she had done enough. She had survived far longer than most agents in the field. She had accomplished more than could reasonably be expected. It was time for her to stand down.
Nancy was disappointed, but accepted the decision. She spent the final months of the war in London, working in SOE headquarters, helping to plan operations and debrief agents returning from the field. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, Nancy participated in victory celebrations. But the celebrations felt hollow. She had lost too much. Henri was dead. Many friends and comrades had been killed. The France she had fought to liberate was economically devastated and politically fractured. Victory brought relief that the fighting was over, but not joy. The human cost had been too high. In the immediate post-war period, Nancy received her various decorations and awards. She attended ceremonies, shook hands with dignitaries, and accepted praise for her service. But she felt disconnected from the celebrations. The war had changed her fundamentally. She couldn't relate to people who hadn't shared those experiences. Even fellow veterans often couldn't discuss what they had really done and felt. Many things remained classified. Personal trauma remained private. Nancy found it difficult to explain what the war had been like. Civilians couldn't understand. Even well-meaning questions felt intrusive or naive. How many people did you kill? Were you scared? What was the worst thing you saw? These questions couldn't be answered honestly without revealing things Nancy didn't want to share or relive. So Nancy deflected them with humor or vague responses. She developed a public persona that was tough, witty, and comfortable with her wartime service. This persona protected the private Nancy, who was scarred by what she had experienced and done. The search for Henri's fate occupied Nancy for months after the war. She knew he had been arrested. She suspected he was dead. But she needed confirmation. French and British authorities helped her trace Henri's movement through the Gestapo system. Eventually, she learned the truth. Henri had been arrested by Klaus Barbie, the notorious butcher of Lyon, and his men in October 1943.
He was interrogated repeatedly about Nancy's whereabouts and activities. Despite torture, Henri revealed nothing. He was executed in October 1943. His body was disposed of in a mass grave. Learning these details was devastating for Nancy. She blamed herself. If she hadn't involved herself in the resistance, Henri would have survived. He died because of her actions, protecting her and her network. This guilt never left Nancy. For the rest of her life, she carried the weight of Henri's death. She honored his memory by living the kind of life he would have wanted for her. Active, engaged, refusing to be defeated by tragedy. But the pain never fully healed. Henri's death also intensified Nancy's hatred for the Nazis. The assassination of Oberg became, in retrospect, a form of revenge for Henri's murder. Nancy had killed the kind of men who had ordered Henri's death. This didn't bring Henri back, but it felt like justice. The post-war period saw Nancy struggling to find purpose. During the war, every day had clear objectives: survive, complete the mission, fight the enemy. After the war, these clear purposes were gone. What do you do when the defining struggle of your life is over and you're only in your 30s? Nancy tried various occupations. She worked briefly for British intelligence in post-war Germany, helping to identify and locate war criminals. She considered rejoining journalism, but found she no longer had the taste for it. She attempted to settle into domestic life, but found it suffocating. She had lived with danger and purpose for too long. Normal life seemed meaningless in comparison. This is a common experience for combat veterans and intelligence operatives. The intensity of wartime service makes civilian life feel dull and pointless. Activities that once seemed important now seem trivial. Social conventions seem absurd after experiencing life-or-death situations. Nancy suffered from what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, though it wasn't diagnosed as such at the time. She had nightmares about the war. She was hyper-vigilant, always scanning for threats. She had difficulty trusting people. She struggled with authority, having operated independently for so long. She self-medicated with alcohol, which became a serious problem. The British government provided no mental health support for SOE veterans. The organization had been dissolved. Its records were classified. Its operatives were expected to quietly reintegrate into civilian life. Many struggled as Nancy did. Some committed suicide. Others descended into alcoholism or mental illness. There was no support structure, no recognition that these people had endured trauma that would affect them for life. Nancy's second marriage was to John Forward, a former AARF officer. They married in 1945 and remained together until his death in 1997. The marriage was difficult. Nancy was not easy to live with. She was restless, temperamental, and struggled with alcohol. John provided stability and support, but he couldn't heal the wounds the war had left. Nancy's inability to have children was another source of pain. She had wanted a family, but the war years, the stress, possibly physical trauma from her ordeals, left her unable to conceive. This felt like another thing the war had taken from her. In the 1950s and 60s, Nancy lived in Britain but traveled frequently. She couldn't settle. She moved between London, France, and Australia, never feeling home anywhere. The world had changed. She had changed. There was no place where she truly fit anymore. During these decades, Nancy's wartime service remained largely secret. She couldn't discuss it because of the Official Secrets Act. The few people who knew what she had done weren't permitted to publicize it. Nancy was essentially anonymous despite being one of the most decorated women of World War II. This began to change in the 1970s and 80s. The British government started declassifying SOE records. Historians began researching and writing about the organization. Nancy's story began to emerge. A biography was published in 1985. Suddenly, Nancy was famous. Television programs interviewed her. Newspapers wrote features. Her story was taught in schools. Nancy became a symbol of female courage and capability in wartime. The attention was overwhelming. Nancy was in her 70s, living quietly, and suddenly she was a public figure. She gave interviews and participated in documentaries. She received additional honors and awards. She attended ceremonies, shook hands with dignitaries, and accepted praise for her service. but she felt disconnected from the celebrations. The war had changed her fundamentally. She couldn't relate to people who hadn't shared those experiences. Even fellow veterans often couldn't discuss what they had really done and felt. Many things remained classified. Personal trauma remained private.
The feminist movement of the 1970s and 80s embraced Nancy as a symbol. Here was proof that women could excel in traditionally male domains. Nancy had commanded men in combat, killed enemy soldiers, and survived in conditions that would have broken most people. Feminists used Nancy's story to argue against restrictions on women's roles in the military and other fields. Nancy was supportive of this, but uncomfortable with being made into a symbol. She insisted that any policy decisions about women's roles should be based on capability, not on her individual example. Not all women could do what she had done, but then most men couldn't either. The criterion should be ability to do the job, regardless of gender. In the 1990s, as Nancy entered her 80s, her health declined. She had survived so much during the war, but age was catching up with her. She moved into assisted living, eventually requiring full-time care. But her mind remained sharp. She continued giving interviews and receiving visitors. She maintained her sense of humor and her forthright personality. She remained engaged with the world. When asked about her legacy, Nancy was dismissive. She didn't think in terms of legacy. She had done what needed to be done when it needed to be done. That was all. If her story inspired others, that was fine, but she wasn't trying to be inspirational. She was just trying to survive and fight back against evil. This unself-conscious heroism is characteristic of people who perform genuinely extraordinary acts. They don't think of themselves as heroes. They're just responding to circumstances as best they can. It's only in retrospect, when others analyze their actions, that the heroism becomes apparent. Nancy died in August 2011, at age 98. She had outlived virtually everyone who had known her during the war. She had outlived most of the people who had celebrated her in the 1980s and 90s. She died as she had lived, on her own terms, without fuss or drama. Her funeral was attended by French, British, and Australian officials. She was honored as a war hero by 3 nations. Her ashes were scattered as she had requested. There was no permanent memorial, which is what Nancy wanted. She didn't want statues or plaques. The story of Nancy Wake matters today for several reasons. First, it's simply an extraordinary story of human courage and capability. Nancy did things that seem impossible. She survived when the odds were overwhelmingly against her. She made a real difference in the outcome of World War II. Second, Nancy's story challenges gender stereotypes. She proved that women could excel in roles society said they couldn't perform. She commanded men in combat, she killed enemy soldiers, and she endured physical and psychological hardships equal to anything men faced. This demonstration of capability has implications beyond World War II. If women could do these things in the 1940s, they can do them now. Any arguments for restricting women's roles based on capability are undermined by examples like Nancy. Third, Nancy's story illustrates the importance of individual agency in history. We often think of historical events as driven by large forces, economics, ideology, demographics, but individuals also matter. Nancy's decisions and actions affected the course of the war, not decisively, perhaps, but meaningfully. The hundreds of people she helped escape, the supplies she organized, the operations she led, the German general she killed. These things mattered. They saved lives and hurt the Nazi war effort. One person making courageous choices can make a difference. Fourth, Nancy's story reminds us of the moral complexity of war. She killed people. She made decisions that led to deaths of both enemy soldiers and French civilians caught in reprisals.
She operated in moral gray areas where clear ethical judgments are difficult. She did what she believed was necessary to fight an evil regime. But necessary doesn't mean simple or without cost. Nancy lived with the moral weight of her actions. We should think seriously about that weight, rather than simplifying her story into uncomplicated heroism. Fifth, Nancy's struggles after the war remind us that veterans carry unseen wounds. Nancy survived the war physically, but she was damaged psychologically. She struggled with trauma, guilt, alcohol, and adjustment to civilian life. These struggles don't diminish her achievements. They're part of the full story of what war does to people. Sixth, Nancy's story demonstrates the importance of resistance against oppression. When Nazi Germany occupied France, many people accommodated themselves to the occupation. They kept their heads down and tried to survive. This was understandable. But it was people like Nancy who refused to accommodate and chose to resist who kept the spirit of freedom alive. Without resistance, the Nazis never fully controlled France. With resistance, the Nazis never fully controlled France. This matters symbolically and practically. Finally, Nancy's story offers lessons about how we remember war and honor veterans. Nancy was uncomfortable with being made into a hero. She insisted that she was just one of many who resisted. She pointed out that luck played a large role in her survival. She refused to claim that she was braver or better than those who died. This humility is worth emulating. We should honor veterans without turning them into simplistic symbols. We should remember their service while acknowledging the complexity of what they did and experienced. We should recognize that not all veterans are comfortable with hero worship, and that some carry burdens that honors and awards can't address. The specific question of what happened to General Oberg deserves clarification. Historical records confirmed that Karl Oberg survived the war. He was captured by American forces in June 1945. He was tried by French courts for war crimes. In 1946, he was sentenced to death. The sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment. He served time in French prisons until he was released in 1962. He lived quietly in Germany until his death in 1965. This raises the question, did Nancy actually kill Oberg? The answer is complex. Nancy participated in operations against high-ranking Nazi officials. She commanded Maquis forces that ambushed German officers. In the chaos of guerrilla warfare, many engagements were poorly documented. Nancy may have participated in an operation that targeted Oberg, or an operation targeting another high-ranking SS officer that became conflated with Oberg in later retellings.
Alternatively, Nancy may have claimed responsibility for an operation against Oberg to enhance her reputation or to claim a symbolic victory against one of France's worst war criminals. It's also possible that Nancy killed a different German general or high-ranking officer, and the identity of this person was later confused with Oberg's in the telling and retelling of stories. War stories often get embellished or confused over time. Details change, different stories get merged together. Years later, when people try to reconstruct what happened, the truth can be elusive. What we can say with certainty is that Nancy did command Maquis forces in combat operations against German forces. She did kill or help kill German soldiers. She did operate at a level where targeting high-value German officers would have been within her scope of operations. Whether the specific story about Oberg is literally true, or is a composite of several operations, or is an embellishment of Nancy's actual achievements, the essential truth remains. Nancy Wake was one of World War II's most effective resistance fighters. She commanded forces in combat. She organized successful operations against German forces. She survived years of dangerous work in occupied territory. She earned more medals and decorations than any other female World War II veteran. These facts are documented and not in dispute. The specific details of individual operations, including exactly which German officers she killed, are less clear. This is true of many wartime stories. The fog of war, the passage of time, the natural human tendency to simplify and dramatize complex events, all of these factors make reconstructing exact truth difficult. What matters most is the broader truth of Nancy's service and sacrifice. She chose to fight when she could have chosen safety. She risked her life repeatedly to combat Nazi occupation. She demonstrated courage, capability, and leadership that saved lives and contributed to Allied victory. The story of the woman who took down a general may be literally true, may be approximately true, or may be symbolic truth that captures the essence of Nancy's wartime service, even if the specific details are uncertain. In the context of Nancy's full story, this one operation, whatever its exact nature, is just one episode among many. Nancy's significance doesn't rest on whether she personally killed one specific general. It rests on her sustained record of courage and effectiveness over years of dangerous work. The tendency to focus on dramatic individual episodes sometimes obscures the more impressive achievement of sustained courage over time. It's relatively easy to be brave for a moment. It's much harder to be brave day after day, month after month, year after year, when the danger never stops and the psychological pressure never relents. Nancy did that. She sustained her commitment and courage through years of danger. That's the real achievement. The medals and decorations Nancy received tell part of the story. The George Medal from Britain, the American Medal of Freedom, the Croix de Guerre 3 times, the Médaille de la Résistance, the Legion of Honor. These are not given lightly. They represent official recognition that Nancy performed exceptional service. But medals can't capture what service actually meant. The fear, the exhaustion, the moral rate of command, the losses, the trauma, the guilt. Nancy carried all of this for the rest of her life. The real cost of her service was paid not during the war, but in the decades after, as she struggled to live with what she had experienced and done. This is why simplistic hero worship is inadequate. Nancy was heroic, but she was also human, flawed, struggling. Recognizing both her achievements and her struggles is the most honest way to honor her memory. The impact of Nancy's story on popular culture has been significant. Books have been written about her. Television documentaries have featured her. There have been discussions about making a film of her life. She has been the subject of plays and musical productions. Nancy's story has appeal because it combines elements that make for compelling narrative. A strong, complex protagonist, high stakes, danger and adventure, moral clarity. Fighting Nazis is unambiguously good. Romance and tragedy in her relationship with Henry. Triumph and vindication in her success and recognition. This makes for good entertainment, but entertainment shouldn't be confused with the reality of what Nancy experienced. The real Nancy was tougher, more complicated, more damaged, and ultimately more interesting than most dramatizations suggest. Future generations will continue to rediscover Nancy's story. As long as people are interested in World War II, in women's history, in stories of courage and resistance, Nancy Wake will be remembered. Her story deserves to be remembered, not just as entertainment or inspiration, but as a historical record of one person's response to evil. Nancy saw evil, she chose to fight it, and she paid a price for that choice. That's a story worth preserving. The lessons of Nancy's story remain relevant. We still live in a world where people face choices about whether to resist oppression or accommodate it. We still debate women's capabilities and roles.
we still struggle with how to honor veterans while acknowledging the costs of their service. Nancy's example doesn't provide simple answers to these questions, but it does provide a data point, one example of how one person responded to circumstances. As we reflect on Nancy Wake and legacy, several conclusions seem warranted. First, individual courage and determination can make a difference, even in the face of overwhelming evil. Nancy's contribution to defeating Nazi Germany was real, if modest, in the grand scheme of things. Second, women are capable of extraordinary courage and effectiveness in roles traditionally reserved for men. Nancy proved this beyond any doubt. Third, war damages people even when they survive physically. Nancy's post-war struggles remind us that victory has costs beyond battlefield casualties. Fourth, heroism is often uncomfortable for heroes. Nancy was ambivalent about being celebrated and insisted she wasn't special. This humility is itself admirable. Fifth, the truth of historical events is often complex and uncertain. The exact details of Nancy's operations may never be fully known, but the essential truth of her service is clear. Nancy Grace Augusta Wake was an extraordinary woman who made extraordinary contributions to the defeat of Nazi Germany. She deserves to be remembered not as a symbol or a myth, but as a real person who made difficult choices, endured terrible circumstances, and emerged with both achievements and scars. Her story is part of the larger story of World War II. It's part of the story of the French resistance. It's part of women's history. And it's a story worth telling and retelling, as long as we tell it honestly and completely. Nancy Wake took down more than a general. She helped take down an evil regime. She proved that courage isn't limited by gender, and she demonstrated that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when circumstances demand it. That's a legacy worth celebrating and preserving.